my guests, former senior counsel to President Trump, Kellyanne Conway, and Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's founder, Clifford May. Thank you both for being here. Kellyanne, let me start with you on that point about the politics. We are hearing a rising chorus of Republicans critical of this war, worried about whether it's actually diverting resources away from what may be the longer struggle with China. We heard Senator Hawley of Missouri talking about that this week. Do you think American political support for what Biden says, as long as it takes, the U.S. will be there, do you think that support will hold?
The public is pretty split on it. They're not split about the right of Ukrainians to defend themselves as a sovereign nation. They're not split necessarily about the need to defeat Putin. The question for most Americans right now, Jerry, goes to at what cost? So you have this rising anti-war sentiment on the left, and you have some of the libertarians and center-right folks in the Republican Party saying, hey, we can open up our hearts very widely, but why are we opening up our pocketbooks infinitely? And they're very concerned that most of what we're giving is not humanitarian aid. I mean, look at the statistics. It's military and other aid. And unlike the last administration, where we were actually not engaged in new conflicts, and also where we were getting more of our NATO allies to pay toward the common defense, where they had been, sort of deadbeat dads on the world stage doing that, we're going in the opposite direction. The U.S. is footing the largest share of this bill. So I think the public does believe, if you look at the polls, pretty split in three in terms of if they want this to wrap up quickly. It's not their choice one way or the other. If they are patient enough to have it prolong, if in fact it means sovereignty and freedom for Ukraine, and then others kind of shrugging their shoulders in the middle. The young people are important here. I think Joe Biden's going to struggle in his party on this one because, remember, the anti-Vietnam War sentiment fed the modern Democratic Party. Some of the older people are against the war, but the young people are really rising up in these town hall meetings at AOC, Hakeem Jeffries, calling them out and worried, as you pointed out, worried about perhaps a nuclear catastrophe or a larger conflict since China and Russia look like we finally found Russia collusion, but unfortunately it's with China.
Cliff May, let's talk about the strategic and the implications for U.S. foreign policy here. You've been a strong supporter of Ukraine, as indeed I think most of us are. But is this open-ended commitment? It does look as though, look, Ukraine's made extraordinary efforts in the last year and has repulsed the Russians. The Russians have performed incredibly badly. But Putin's got tremendous resources. He can keep throwing in men at this fight. This does look like a kind of a long stalemate. Is this open-ended commitment by the U.S. wise in terms of our U.S. strategic objectives?
Well, look, I give Biden credit for going to Kiev. I give Biden credit for his rhetoric. But he has to do more than that. If he wants to will the ends, he must will the means. Or as young people say, if you're going to talk the talk, you better walk the walk. That means not slow rolling out the aid to Ukraine. Ukraine should have had the means, the tanks, for example, the artillery, to wage a very decisive offensive over the winter months. They planned to. They didn't have the tools. We didn't give it to them, especially if China's coming in. Now, this, I think one important strategic point that needs to be made is this is a war taking place in Ukraine, but it's not just about Ukraine. Putin and Xi Jinping, his partner, and Ali Khamenei, who's also a junior partner in this and is supplying weapons to Putin, what they seek to do is replace the U.S. as the global leader. They want to diminish, if not destroy, the U.S. If they can do so in this instance, in the Ukraine war, despite what America has given and what America has done so far, believe me, Taiwan is next on the list. We are also, Biden on 4 occasions has said he will defend Taiwan. Militarily, we're not there and ready to do that. There would be tens of thousands of U.S. deaths in that. At a certain point, the American century is over, and the Xi Jinping century and the Communist Chinese century has begun. So we better be very careful. By the way, one more point, $113 billion, a lot of money. Yeah. What, as a percentage of the U.S. defense budget, 1.6%, not a lot.
I would just quickly want to follow up, Cliff, before we take a break. You mentioned, obviously, this alliance between Russia and China, and as you mentioned, also Iran. Do you think this struggle should be seen in the context, unfortunately, nobody wants to think of it in these terms, but as like the first struggle in a much wider and longer Cold War, like we had the Cold War with like instances of hot war as we're getting right now? Is this a long-term struggle for the U.S. and its allies against this axis, dare I call it that, of Russia, China, and Iran?
think there's no question about that. It's Cold War 2.0. I'm not the first to say that. Historian Neil Ferguson, H.R. McMaster has said that. Congressman Mike Gallagher, they all see it that way. Now, that's bad news in a way, but it's good news in this way. If you understand you're fighting a Cold War, you have a chance of winning it. If only your adversaries know that you're fighting a war, you will lose it. What do you want to do in a Cold War? Prevent it from getting hot and make sure you prevail in the end, and you need a strategy. We don't have a strategy for Cold War 2.0 because we don't have an administration that understands we are in Cold War 2.0.